Okay, so I think we are at the start of this. Is recording ready to go? So this is a BOF session, which is a little weird in this format, but I'm going to try to make it work. Which is that I'm going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes level setting a little bit and describing some of the background of the Knative project. And then it will be an extended Q&A and discussion time, and Jessie and I will probably be running around with microphones to get all the audio recorded so people who didn't get to come to KubeCon or wanted to attend something else during this time can at least find out what we talked about. They don't get to ask questions, though. That's for you. So, without further ado, a lot of people have started talking their Knative talks about the different software components in Knative. That's interesting, but I feel like some of the key pieces of Knative are actually a step or two back from that in the philosophy. So when we were starting on this project, one of the things that we thought was really important was actually that we were going to improve the experience for developers in particular. Operators actually seem to have it pretty good in Kubernetes. You've got lots of controls. It's really easy to extend. Oh, look, here's all this stuff you can do. And yeah, you're going to have to learn a bunch of concepts, but you want those concepts anyway because you want to talk about your policy, and you want to talk about your network access controls, and you want to talk about all of these different things. And I realized that I forgot to introduce what these three personas are. How many people are familiar with personas and the general idea behind this sort of user interface design? So for those of you who haven't raised your hands, that's totally fine. I hadn't encountered them until maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago. But the idea is that you define some particular users that you imagine wanting to use your system, and you talk about what their needs are and what their desires are rather than sort of abstract system capabilities. And so oftentimes these correlate to things like user journeys, where you say, hey, I am a developer. I write code that solves business problems. I need to manage inventory at this store. What are the steps I need to do in order to ship this software, get a big bonus, and go on vacation at the end of the year? And that's my interest. My interest is not necessarily, I want to learn a bunch of new technology, or, hey, I really want to learn a lot about distributed systems. I want us to not run out of inventory during Christmas. That's my job. And so, how do we make that easy for them? Operators are people who provide the infrastructure, who probably enforce corporate policy. Hey, maybe you shouldn't be pulling random Docker images, or maybe, it's awesome that you're using Node, but maybe we should make sure that you're not installing more than one cryptocurrency miner per process. So operators have, in Kubernetes, a bunch of tools. They have a bunch of problems too, but the community is very well engaged with things like registry scanning and policy. If you saw some of the OPA talks, we're even getting into pretty complicated attribute-based access control there. Developers, it's like, hey, check in your code, learn Docker, check in a bunch of YAML, figure out what your CI/CD system looks like, and then you can start solving your problems. Don't worry, I only told you about 5 or 6 things. There's actually about 10 or 12 nouns you're going to need to know in order to be productive. That's 10 or 12 nouns that they can't use thinking about their business problems. So the goal for Knative was to make it, hey, here's 2 or 3 things you need to know. They're the bare minimum you need to know, and they'll give you a lot of power and leverage. The third thing, which over here is this lovely yellow that is kind of hard to read on the screen, is contributors. And those are the folks, here in the front and scattered through the audience who are actually writing the Knative software. And we want to make things good for them so we have enough contributors that we can keep building the software project. They're not the end goal, but they're how we get to the end goal. And our thesis is that if we make developers love Knative and we make it no worse for operators than their current workload, they'll be happy to add it into their clusters, and then we'll have a lot of people running Knative and a lot of happy developers, and contributors will want to go and make a difference because we will make it easy and rewarding for them. And so sometimes you'll hear me call out specific people for functionality. That's because I want to say thank you for contributing. And we think that our audience sizes look like this, except that the scale here is probably more logarithmic than linear. So there's a whole bunch of people, most people really, who are developing software should be doing it in a stateless, something like a 12-factor case, unless you're working on databases, for example, and then you really don't get to be stateless. And I'm sorry, but we're not solving your problems. You still have to figure out your states and your transactions and everything else. But everybody else should be able to use your abstractions in the same way they use our abstractions. And so lots and lots of people should be able to not keep a lot of state around and just write their software. Operators, there's going to be a bunch of you, hybrid, on-prem, cloud. I see folks from IBM here and Red Hat and Pivotal, I think I saw here, and we've been working with a bunch of smaller companies and people who you don't necessarily think of traditionally as like cloud or operator personas. And then of course, contributors, we're here to encourage you to get involved. Since we're talking a lot about what developers want, that changes over time. What you want on day one is not the same thing that you want on day 365. In fact, some of the things you want on day one are stuff that you'd be terrified of on day 365. On day one, someone's like, hey, did you hear about that Knative project? You should check it out. And you're like, well, I've got an hour. Let's see what I can learn. Is this any good? Ideally, you don't want to install stuff on your laptop for day one. You want to go to a web page, read some documentation, and get a chance to play with it on someone else's cloud for a little while. Or, maybe you have Minikube or something like that and you're willing to install it. But for the most part, you want low commitment because you're going to be day one with a lot of things, but you're not going to be day 365 with all of those. Or I dread to see what your production stack looks like. So day 7, you've decided, oh yeah, this is actually worth trying out. It's worth an experiment. I'm going to do a hack. I'm going to do a little feature on the project, or I'm going to show a demo of how this would work in our environment. You're probably working on your own, but you're actually starting to do stuff, and you've maybe deployed 5 or 10 or 30 or 50 revisions, depending on whether you have Joe's cool little hook that every time you save does a new deployment. And day 30 is what I call it, where you've converted your team, and your team is building something, but you haven't shipped anything yet. And day 365, there's money in this system, and you have to keep it running, and you have customers. And if you made a mistake on day 7 on your assessment, and you got to day 365, well, you get to own that mistake. You're not going to change that without a lot of effort. So we want to make sure that if you choose to invest in us on day 1 or day 7, that on day 365 you're still happy about that choice. And so these are some of the tools. You'll note that the stack gets bigger as you go along in terms of demands and requirements. But you're also getting more people involved, and you're actually changing your organization in some sense as you go along. So, day 1 and day 7, it's probably you and your laptop. Maybe day 7 is your personal Kubernetes cluster or Minikube or something like that. Day 30, maybe you're starting to have everybody has their own sandbox, and then you have a place where you merge and integrate. And on day 365, you've got staging, pre-prod, prod, controlled rollouts, rollbacks, postmortems when you screw up software releases and stuff like that. And to be clear, postmortems are good. People screw up software releases all the time. I have done it to larger figures than I'd like to admit. So, people are fallible. That's why we try to get out of some of this business with CI and CD and stuff like that. And as you head towards day 365 as well, you start to use more and more of the tools, and you start to get into more of the complexity. So you'll see on day 1 and day 7, you're probably mostly interacting with service. You're probably mostly in run latest. Day 30, you're probably figuring out how to do your releases and stuff like that. And you're starting to learn about the lower layers of the system. And we don't want to hide those from you completely. We don't want to say, no, you don't get to touch Istio because that's too complicated for you. Don't worry about that. We want to say, don't get into Istio until you need to solve these kinds of problems that Istio is good at. And then, here's Istio, and you've unlocked a power-up, basically. And we should work well. If you are managing Istio and we are managing Istio, it should be really clear, and we're not as good at this today as we should be, where that boundary is. And as you go on towards day 365, you're probably starting to take advantage of stuff like Kubernetes admission controllers, and you're really owning that whole Kubernetes cluster rather than, oh, I'm in a small sandbox on top. And that's your organization. You as a developer, you may still be actually I don't want root. I want to write my code, but somebody else is making sure that all of that admission control and everything else is safe and protected, and every time I build an image, we're scanning it for vulnerabilities, and we're making sure to only run things from validated repos and things like that. And so with that, everyone likes to talk about the different components that we have, and so here's the obligatory, these are the main components and most of the main working groups. And I apologize for the colors. They don't look the same on my screen. So most of these are interesting topics that are going on in the 3 main working groups, serving, build, and eventing. But I also want to call out that we have a bunch of cross-cutting concerns, and we have working groups for those too. So if you're interested in documentation or how do you actually release an open source project? We don't know the answer yet, but if you have good ideas, right now the contributor productivity working group works on both that and testing, but I'm sure they would appreciate your help, and each of the working groups for serving, build, and eventing also has to figure out pieces of that puzzle. So, I'd say there's open questions in all of these, but the big question here is, what do people want to talk about? So that's your invitation to stick up a hand and ask a question about any part of Knative you're curious about. Thank you, Matt.
Christy was wondering why pipelines is gray.
Oh, pipelines was gray because I wasn't sure if we would have Christy here, and I forgot to update the slides. And maybe you can talk a little bit about pipelines, because I bet nobody knows anything about them.
Oh, I don't. This did not go the way I was hoping.
You can stand up here if you want. You can. The microphone will hear you wherever you are. But
I'm so happy that you did this to me, Matt. This is great. So yeah, Pipelines is a new project. It's building on some of the cool stuff that we have in Knative Build. So I think at this conference you've seen that people are, there's a camera that's a, okay. You've seen that people are very excited about Knative Build and using it for a lot of things. And then there's more complicated use cases that people have been coming up with where they want to put different builds together in a pipeline, or maybe have like a graph of, they want to put builds together in a pipeline and have a graph. And yeah, anyway, so that's what Pipelines is about. It's more complicated use cases for build. So we want to use build as a building block for pipelines for CI/CD. And we're hoping to kind of have like a standard around Kubernetes native CI/CD. And we're working with some external partners to make that happen. And that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a great example of some of the ecosystem benefit we'd hoped to get when we started this project. If there was an existing standard way for doing Kubernetes build that actually was Kubernetes as opposed to go somewhere else and figure out some other system, we would latch onto that the same way that we latched onto Istio, and we've started with ELK for observability, and Prometheus and Zipkin for observability. But not seeing one, we tried to find a place where we could start bringing those people together.
So regarding CI/CD, are we thinking then that we would go so far as maybe doing everything that, say, GitLab does for CI/CD?
Sorry, Christy.
You're not sorry. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
I'm just curious how far we're thinking of going with the whole build pipeline CI/CD, whether we're moving into that space of what somebody like, or a company like GitLab is doing with the build process and CI/CD?
I think what we're hoping to do is build an interface that many different providers of CI/CD could implement and use. So I think anyone who wants to be providing CI/CD could potentially comply with this interface. So the interface is the most valuable part, just like expressing, like, I need these things to occur, I need them to occur in this order, this thing needs these inputs and provides these outputs, and like that kind of thing. So we're hoping that more and more CI/CD providers would be like getting involved with this project and building on top of it.
Oh, there's someone back there. And yeah, so this project has gotten large enough that even as someone who's in the tech oversight committee, I don't have all of it in my head, so that's why I'm passing the mic around.
Okay, so eventing.
Yes.
What are the use cases? I mean, kind of thinking, can you, it's pretty broad, but I've seen something, but I haven't seen details.
Okay, so the question was, what are the use cases for eventing? I see a bunch of people with strong opinions here in the front row. I'm going to stick my 2 cents in first, and then I'm going to pass the mic down the row a little bit.
Do I use it as a messaging queue?
So there was a great Cloud Events talk yesterday about that included some opinions about the difference between eventing and messaging. It was the Cloud Events deep dive, and if you get a chance to see those slides, there's some good insights. But I think the key piece that eventing is intended to be is a pattern where when changes happen, there's a way of recording that they happened and delivering it to interested parties. The talk yesterday distinguished eventing from messaging in that in events things happen and you shout about what you're doing, and maybe somebody's listening and maybe nobody's there. And typically in messaging, you have some idea as to who you're trying to tell about what you're doing. So instead of just being like, okay, I'm creating this object over here. Okay, I created a new pod. Hey, by the way, I updated a database row. Instead, it's, hey, I updated this database row. Carlos is going to want to know about it, and so I'm going to pass it over to Carlos, who has some opinions about eventing as well.
Yeah, eventing is, we're going to explain it for developers, right? The Knative, at the end of the day, is for developers. So developers want to, I know a bunch of JavaScript developers, front-end developers, right, that they don't know even how to spell Kubernetes, which that's fine, right? But they know about eventing in a browser. So I usually use that analogy that usually do they program an event way. So they can program of when somebody clicks that button, somebody will listen, right? And then you write a function and you write a handler. So that will be eventing. Then messaging could be something like, I want to send a message to that guy and that guy and that guy because we already have a relationship, and that will be messaging. But at the end of the day, you as a developer, you're writing code to handle that data. So it's all about data. So data could be communication, it could be weather, it could be click events. So the decoupling allows us to build patterns, enterprise patterns, where we can create ETLs, process data for machine learning, process data for web APIs. So the decoupling is where the eventing comes. That's why we created these primitives in Knative, where we have a channel, event sources, and subscription. I don't know if you have the slide. with the diagram, but that'll be useful. So those are my 2 cents on my background.
And to tie it in with the previous question, there's a lot of interesting intersections between event sources and things you would trigger builds on. So hopefully we'll see those composed soon too.
Both a little follow-up and a question. Follow-up is, I use just distinguishing the eventing from the messaging as a pull versus push, right? Is that fair enough to say? In the event, you raise the event, so then whoever wants to listen subscribes.
I think
Whereas,
it's a little bit, I think pull versus push is a transport question. And there's some implementation there where you can do push messaging, and you could pull interested events that have built up on a queue. Oftentimes, you might use pull for managing messaging,
right,
and push for eventing, but I don't think it's required to work that way.
More of implementation
And
layer.
it's a little bit fuzzy in some cases, and eventing typically works by sending messages. So, but rather than the applications knowing intrinsically, like, hey, I'm going to send this over here, it's a little bit more like on top of somebody drawing the topology rather than writing it into the code. And it looks like Carlos has more stuff he wants to say.
At the end of the day, at least for developers, they should not care, right? The infrastructure, the Kubernetes infrastructure, or whoever is building these event sources are the ones going to deliver that message to your function.
Right.
Your function didn't know if there was a microservices
Right.
pulling for events or just listening. Ideally, even in the perfect world, every event source should be pushing notifications, because nobody wants to spend time just like, are you there? Are you there? Are you there? Right? But we have systems of records, we have legacy systems or classic systems that you have to do it, because those systems are already established, and you're not going to have those systems change to send events. So one example is I've worked with CouchDB. So CouchDB doesn't have a way of saying, hey, when somebody inserts a NoSQL document into your database, go and send an HTTP request to this URL. So we have to create a microservice where it can configure that, and it will pull, it will connect to the database, and it will start listening for messages, interested
Polling,
messages,
yeah.
and it start pulling. So, but that's my rant for not everyone pushing.
Just a quick follow-up. There's a lot of sort of research on this on the reactive systems. Are you pulling all that in as you're designing the eventing stuff? I mean, there's a lot of work by Lightbend and the reactive systems and Akka and all of the.
So
is any of that factor into your stuff?
We've been talking with a lot of people with both messaging and eventing backgrounds. I'd say one of the challenges has been to get a quorum of people on the same page. I'm not even going to say a substantial majority, because there's a lot of different use cases, and some people want to use events as glue, and some people want to do like heavy-duty thousands of requests per second or millions of events per second type processing. It's hard to design a system that will meet all of those needs, and we're likely to end up in a place where a lot of things fit, but we also want to build in safety valves. If you were here at Joe's last talk about autoscaling, I think it's related there. You can plug in different autoscalers to Knative's serving stack. So if you discover that our default concurrency-based autoscaler is no good for you, then you can plug in something else, and Joe actually showed how you can plug in your own custom algorithm in addition to like the Kubernetes horizontal pod autoscaler. So ideally, you could plug in some of these opinions like Akka or Lightbend either at the beginning or at the end of pipelines or other things that we're doing. And I forgot to mention pipelines as part of what eventing is doing, because that piece is currently pretty well established. Any other questions? How many people here actually have had a chance to try Knative? Well, that's pretty cool. What? Well, yeah, I was also going to say, how many people have had a chance to look at any of our documentation or any of that like surface level day one type things? Okay, looks like a few more people. Yeah, we are interested in all of that feedback, and that's actually was going to be my last slide. Was you know, we're really interested if you've had a chance to try it and it didn't work for you or it did work for you from hearing what went well and what went badly. If you're interested, most of our repos have good first issue tags on some set of things. It's a little bit hard to resist fixing those sometimes because you're like, I could fix this so quickly. And it's like, but someone else could learn from it. I shouldn't take this issue. I should write it up instead. And so sometimes we're better than others. Docs, we have I'd say we're doing okay on docs, but there's probably lots of places where we could have better samples. One of the projects that someone pointed out a month or two ago is we have a bunch of pinpoint docs about how to do specific thing, but there isn't something that does the overall flow that puts everything together. So if you have examples that put together multiple components into one big arc, it'd be very interesting to see those and see what the install and stuff like that looks like. And yeah, we're interested in talking with lots of people who are solving problems in this space. We'd like to collaborate. In some cases, that may mean, hey, wait, somebody else had a great idea. Maybe we can just use that. In some cases, it will involve like shim and adapter layers. So one of the things we're doing shortly after we launched, we use Istio for our routing mesh for our HTTP routing right now because it gives us HTTP routing, but then there's a bunch of other features that it adds, but it also adds a lot of complexity, and Istio can be cluster root if you have sidecar injection enabled. So maybe you're not comfortable with that. And so we've actually worked in the 0.2 release to make it so that we abstract that networking functionality so that you could plug in different implementations. And there is a demo or beta level integration, I think, with Contour. Someone can correct me if we're further than that. So you could replace Istio with Contour. And the way we do that is with an internal CRD that describes what we wish the resources looked like. And then we take our external things, turn them into what we wish things look like, and then we have something that takes what we wish things looks like and takes it to Istio or takes it to Contour. The autoscaler works, a pluggable autoscaler works in the same way. We'd love to talk about other places like that where, you know, we can plug in more options. We are doing that a little bit in the observability space as well. And yeah, we're very interested in feedback, and Matt is interested in saying something too.
Yeah, so there's actually a recording of the demo of plugging in Heptio. Someone say something? All right. Of plugging in Heptio's Contour to the networking layer. I think Dimitri, who I don't know if he's in the audience, did need to tweak it. We need a whole number of features, and I think it was missing like header decoration or something like that. So it's not quite ready for general consumption, but it helped prove the concept. And you know, we've talked to folks like Linkerd and whatnot, touring the booth. So hopefully we will see more integrations at that layer too for folks who aren't, you know, drunk on Istio Kool-Aid like some of us.
Istio solves a lot of my problems and gives me others.
Guess since everyone's quiet, I'll go again. Since I think the audience in general is fairly new to Knative, can you help us position it in terms of the other offerings? There's OpenFaaS and functions and serverless, and also in terms of the cloud events, you know, how do you standardize? Can you just help us understand where does Knative, and maybe where did Knative, the name came from? Like, is there, because is it a developer experience aspect to it too? Should it be KDEX or something?
I think that's part of it. So I had a really good answer for this yesterday when I got put on the spot in a talk, and I don't think that I had a microphone, so no one will ever hear it again. I'll see if I can recreate it. So At Google, we've built a few serverless platforms, and every time we do, we have regrets about design choices we made different ways. We were going through one of those rounds and thought, well, if we're going to do it again, we should really do it in open source, and we should look at and learn from the other offerings out there. And having done it a number of times, we had a number of features we knew we wanted. And we looked at a lot of the existing offerings and what it would take to bend them into the shape we imagined. And by the time we looked at doing that, ideally, and the other piece here is that we wanted as much as possible to leverage underlying concepts and underlying technologies. One of the serverless platforms we built, App Engine Flex, is built in turn on top of Google's VM-based infrastructure. And it's been gratifying to see how much performance optimizations and gains we've made over the last few years without having to lift a finger as the underlying platforms get faster. And so we wanted to be able to recreate that experience in the open source. But we also wanted a bunch of features, some of which you'll recognize from things like App Engine, about tracking revisions and percentage-based rollout and easy rollback. Coming from the SRE side of the organization, fast rollback is particularly important to me as a way to solve something like 80% probably of your issues is, hey, we made a change recently. How do I go back? Either it will solve the problem or it will prove that it's not part of the most recent change I made and it's something else. And so we knew we wanted that, and we knew that Istio provided that kind of fine-grained percentage-based rollout. And so we started looking, okay, what do we need to make a good serverless platform? What can we reuse? What's extensible? And what can we take pieces of in order to make it work? And it's been a little less than a year since we really started working on this, and a couple of the principles we had were to try to make each piece stand alone. Eventing doesn't do this as well as we'd like today. But you can install build and not need serving or eventing. You can install serving and not need build or eventing. Today, if you install eventing, you need serving, but only for certain event sources. But right now, our packaging isn't good enough to make that fine-grained. And so that's one of the things that we want to fix there. But ideally, Joe Beda described this as the voltron effect. You have a bunch of pieces that are useful, and someone who wants to go and take build and use it to launch deployments, and they don't care about serverless, they should be able to do that. But if you put them all together, you get a full-powered platform for serverless that looks a lot like the other, the major commercial offerings out there, Lambda or GCF or Azure Cloud or Azure Functions or OpenWhisk, in that it takes your source, you hand it some source code, it takes it, scales it, handles a lot of these pieces, connects events to it, and you can get all that functionality, but it's all built on open source components, and those open source components are each on their own feedback loop that's getting better. But also by being on top of them, we give them incentive to get better. We say, hey, our cold start latency is at 4 seconds. We need it to be at 1 second. This is the work that Istio needs to do. This is the work that Kubernetes needs to do. This is work that nobody is currently doing. And so we are going to create a caching CRD, which is work that Matt Moore did, to describe a desire to have these Docker images already present on the machine so that you're not spending 3 seconds fetching 800 megabytes of Docker layers and unpacking them, because we'll never get to 1 second if we spend 3 seconds there. And so that's kind of how we came about doing it. And so we're working with Cloud Events. In terms of eventing, that's our assumed transport, particularly the HTTP 1.1 binding. Maybe HTTP2 works as well. We're not, later this year, we'll start thinking about how do you do upgrades and things like that. But right now, we have enough other pieces to figure out, including stuff like releases and observability and so forth, that we can only solve so many problems at one time. But all our roadmaps and everything else are public. If you're curious, it should be easy to get involved with any of these things. I failed to actually put a slide that has all of the links on it, but github.com knative docs has a community subsection in there that tells you a lot about how to get involved, the groups to join, the Slack channel to join, and if you find any of the people on the project, I'm sure they'll help you get bootstrapped up. And even if you're not planning on contributing immediately, but you just want to use it, we're excited to get people using it and get feedback too.
So one quick note is going back to CI/CD and the release. So we have another talk, and we'll start in 15 minutes across the street, 6:15, where we are going to talk about for Knative itself, how we run its own CI/CD and how we manage its release. And we would love to see you there.
I'm going to give that back to Evan, but to echo one thing Evan said, right, like about the benefits of layering, it just feels endless, right? Like there was a really cool demo from Ben Browning earlier today about Kiali and like visualizing the traffic, and like he was doing it for Knative deployments, and you were able to do that just by virtue of the fact that we were layered on top of Istio, right? Integration with the mesh, right? Like we're not doing anything special with that, right? Like Istio is injecting things into pods, right? And since there's pods under the hood, investments you make around policy that affects things at the pod level, right? Those should just work with things like Knative. So it's. If they don't, let us know. Yeah, if they don't, let us know. But yeah, so. All of the benefits we get to reap from this massive ecosystem we're building on top of are really exciting. And so seeing all the talks around here and being like, oh, cool, I want to try using that with Knative, it's very exciting and exhausting. So now he has to talk about the name.
Well, I'm going to pass the buck a little bit here to someone who's not here, but we went through a number of names. I think if you go back through the GitHub history, you'll see at some point Elefros, which was a Greek word for lightweight, I think. But we decided that it's great to have all of these Greek-themed interesting names, but maybe something that everyone could pronounce and spell would be better. And we came up with a long list, and this felt like it was both a little bit cute and fairly easy to remember and spell. And hopefully you won't need to call it like K6E or something like that, and you can just spell it out. And so that's where Knative came from. And it was our product manager at the time, DeWitt Clinton, who I think actually found that name. So technically we are over time. If Jessie needs time to set up, I'm going to unplug this stuff. But I'm happy to keep answering questions. Either, oh, you have to go over there. Okay, well then someone else is in here, and I will get rid of this for them.